So I'm going to be going over a few clips of helios and analyzing them, pointing some things out, but mostly analyzing and kind of talking things through the way I see it as a relatively experienced player in the game. There's so many other things that I could also talk about, but I think I'll probably just keep it to the stuff that I see within some of these clips to kind of make things a bit more concise and I guess precise. So this is the first clip that I've decided to go over. And it's pretty much because it's the first clip where I noticed something was very strange, I guess. There was a tournament several years ago that was streamed, I think, on Moo Milk's Twitch channel. And even though the video quality is a little bit low, it definitely shows, I think, everything that needs to be shown. So I'm just gonna, I guess, jump right into it.
Whispers, bro.
So first of all, with just the few several frames that we see, the camera moves very quickly. Now, this could very much indicate that the player is using a very high sensitivity. That's entirely possible. So you kind of need to keep watching to kind of figure out if that's the case or what else might be going on.
And send me to
So those are very small horizontal jitter movements that are also very fast. And from what little information I've seen up to this point, I would say and recommend to this player, if they're actually using a sense like this, that their sensitivity is one, probably too high, because it seems to show that their hand/arm, but mostly hand, is maybe unable to keep a smooth line of tracking for where they're aiming, and perhaps that if they're jittering and they can't control their hand jitter, that you'd want to definitely reduce your sensitivity to minimize the amount of jittering that you're doing.
send me to topping.
And then at this point, we've now had several frames where the screens seem to move at about the same rate and the same direction as an enemy that we kind of see around this area. And so I'm now going to go frame by frame. And there are more jittery motions. But what's really strange about that particular jittering part, I suppose, is that not only were there like left and right jitters, but there was also one segment where a jitter to, I think, to the left side actually stayed.
We go. Send me. And send me to.
So I'm going to watch this again. So the screen kind of moved from the character. So it was obvious because we see the back of the character that the enemy or the character is actually on this cover, this second low cover, and was going to the left. And the screen was tracking that. And if you're really good, sure, maybe you can be tracking that. It's strange, but we could just assume that they're tracking it. Then there's a zoom out, swapping cover, but the screen's going to stay relatively about the same because your flipping animation can change the screen, but it doesn't always have to. You can kind of compensate for it somewhat. But then the screen moves over to the left. And now it's it moved over to the left more slowly. And now we see the back of, the enemy now centered in the middle of the screen, and the camera is moved right a little bit more to about in front of the model, and is still kind of tracking them, and still theoretically tracking them, and still theoretically tracking them, and then moves back over to the left here, and then stops, and then moves back to the right. And it's very difficult for us to see what's happening with any of the enemies over in this area because obviously there's smoke. So all information that we have right now is kind of based on screen movements. But it still kind of moved to the right. And now it sort of seems like there's some movement here. This is potentially the head of one of the swarm, I guess, model that's poking themselves up a little bit. But it's still about centered in the screen. It's hard to tell. So this like pixel with like subpixels or whatever is now moved over to the left a little bit. And now we're flipping our character back around and our camera is roughly still looking at them. At least in that direction. And now it's continued to turn to the left more. So now the center of the screen is like about over here. And then this character pops up. And now the camera moves over to the right side, which is really strange because if you're actually focusing on this player, you should really be just focusing on this player, right? And you don't want to be like aiming off to the side. Really, if you want to stay in cover and try to sort of do a counter sniping thing, you can do that. You can stay in cover and then you can kind of wait for any activity. And as soon as you see activity, you need to be priming yourself to being ready to aim and then shoot. But as soon as this player pops up, the camera now moves to the right. And that's kind of weird. Really unoptimal. Because at least to this point, it seems, I would say painfully obvious that there really aren't any other characters that the screen was focusing on. There's only one character that the screen has been focusing on. So now that the character's popped out, we're aiming to the right. And now we're aiming back to the left onto this character. And now we decide to aim. And this is back when the snipe first bullet accuracy, or basically accuracy in general, was not like pinpoint. And you can kind of see that borne out with the reticle. The spread on the reticle is rather large. But we aim in after the character goes back in cover, and then we go back to our kind of counter sniping tactic. And our screen is still focused right about here. And now our screen is making kind of smooth movements over sort of to the right, and then back over to the left. And now pretty hard more to the right, and a bit over to the left. And now you don't really know what we're doing, but it's a little bit more to the left again, and now back to the right. And at this point, it's obvious that there's something really strange going on, because if you really want to be good at, I guess, a game or sniping or whatever the case might be, you really want to focus on kind of one target at a time. You can see a lot of other things happening in your peripheral vision, but really, in order to be really effective in a lot of engagements, you do kind of have to tunnel vision a little bit. You do need to kind of focus on one particular target and then kind of stick with that. If you want to keep moving your aim left and right, especially when you only see one character, then there's something that's strange is going on. Like, either you can't control your mouse movement and you're jittering, because you really shouldn't be doing that. Really, you want to be pre-aiming in the most accurate and reasonable way possible, given the information that you have. And if you seemingly know where one player is, you want to be focusing on that one player. And then only until you notice there's another player around that you can be focusing on is then when you decide what your priority target would be. But you don't want to see only one target and then have your screen shake all around, right? That doesn't make any sense. You want to be focusing on the one target. So already we have kind of a string of, we could call them decision making, if we want to be kind of polite, because it's possible that all of this horizontal movement has been purposeful for some reason, and don't really understand what that could be because it makes very little sense to me. And so I think the best explanation that's reasonable is that the sensitivity is too high / the player is not able to control their aim when you only see one target. But that's kind of where I am at this point in the clip. So now our camera has moved even more over to the right side. And now we're kind of focusing on, I would say, like the top of water stairs, or maybe just kind of the right side of the smoke. And now we're going back to this middle part of the other side of the low cover. And back right and left and left and right and left and right and left. So even if there were like two potential targets to choose from, like say there were two enemies on the other side of the low cover here, if you want to keep moving right and left with your camera, it's possible that that could make sense. You might see one thing happen with the right target, and it seems like they're about to come off the wall or move along the wall to the edge here because they're close to the edge, and as soon as they get to the edge, they go the standing position and maybe try to up A. You might be able to try to get hit on them. Or if they're moving from side to side on the low cover, you might be able to aim in really quickly and then kind of predict that they'll keep running in some direction and then sort of, shoot them because their head will be exposed if they're moving that quickly along low cover. There are several reasons why, if there are two targets, it could make sense to keep switching between the two as you keep seeing more data on both of the targets. But right now, in my perspective, just watching the video as is, I've only seen one. I've only seen this one target here. So switching the camera back and forth makes very little sense, again. And now we're back to the right. And now a little bit more to the left after being to the right again. And now we decide to aim in when this character pops up for the second time. Now it seems like they're ready to shoot. That's fine. But what this also kind of shows... Second.
Whispers, bro.
And all of this happens extremely fast, as you could see in real time.
The toppings you want.
But what this also shows is that
we gonna make this shit state to state.
After the smoke clears, there is actually a character back there the entire time. So, or at least we should assume that there is a character back there pretty relatively often. So either this player knew that they were there the entire time, like before the smoke came up, before this clip starts, and they're like kind of continually flicking over or something to keep track of where that target is. And that's fine, but only to a certain extent, because you're not really supposed to assume that they're going to be coming through the smoke at any point, any second or whatever, because you can see this one target that you can see right now. And if they do like just come charging through the smoke, whatever, at any like point in time, it doesn't really make as much sense to be ready for that player to go through the smoke, especially in this game where a lot of people are primed, especially pretty early on, to just not fly through smoke. Um, but you have no this player has almost no information on where this player is the entire time the smoke's been up, because we have no information on where that second player is. But we've had a lot of information of where this player's been. They've been along this low wall. They kind of move back and forth. And so even if you knew that there was someone over there, you still wouldn't be moving your reticle over to the side to try to preempt what it is that they're going to do. You still would want to focus on the one target that you see in your screen, and then just keep in the back of your mind that this player could be coming through the smoke at any given point in time, or they could be coming through the back of the pillars behind this player that you're focusing on. But yeah, so the second time they pop up, we get a shot off. The shot hits. That's fine. I'm going to play this clip at full speed all the way through. So these jitters are basically inhuman, because the speed at which the movement happens and the speed at which the movement stops completely is inhuman. There is an actual physics problem that you can do with your mouse, where the amount of energy or force that you put into the mouse in some direction, you need an equal and opposite force to stop the mouse going in that direction. So the faster the mouse is moving in one direction, the more force to an exponential degree is kind of required to stop the mouse at one spot. And then additional force is needed to correct it and go the opposite direction. So the reason why you don't, like when you see players actually do flicks, they don't stop their reticle on the dime. Usually flicks are like, they flick, and then about 75 to 90% of the way through their flick off to the side, their mouse keeps going. It doesn't really stop on a dime. And if it does stop in a really small area, then usually what happens is, because humans are fallible, it'll just be like this. It'll just be like my mouse cursor. I'll go to the right, and then there will be some kind of bounce in some direction. It's basically never where you like stop at a single point. There's always like a bounce. And I don't know if it's like how easy it is to pick it up on the video that I'm recording, but if you stop in a really pinpoint spot, it needs to be a low enough amount of force for you to be able to smoothly slow it down as you're getting close to the end, and then bring the pointer, like the reticle, basically to a stop. But with fast enough movements, that becomes very difficult to do. So either you need to slow down as you're reaching the end, or you reach the end and you want to stop completely, and then you have to put in an exponential amount of force basically to stop it completely. Or really what happens is your hand puts in an over amount of force to make sure it stops, and then that's what causes your reticle to snap back to the side a little bit. So you go to the side, and then you try to put in enough force to stop it, because you don't want to keep going for some reason. It's really important, and it'll bounce off to the side, and you'll have some kind of like bounce. Sometimes it's really small, sometimes it's much more obvious, but there's usually some kind of bounce. So there are just multiple things going on here that are really weird, and I would at least classify the screen corrections here in the most kind way possible. I would say it's too much sensitivity, or there is a problem with actual control with aim. And then the worst way of interpreting it is basically that there's something else going on that's artificially correcting the aim and changing it. And it's not, the player is not doing that, because a human cannot do that. But the one thing is the one weird thing is the screen movements, and the other thing is that there's a large degree of emphasis for some reason placed on a target probably that is likely completely outside of your zone of information and what you should care about because of their position. And if this player is like focusing on them, I think that's kind of a problem because they need to be spending more time focusing on this player. And that this player, the first time they came up, should have been aggressed upon, aimed at least, because that's kind of the point, right? You're trying to be ready to kind of do something here. All right. Anyway, I'll end this one. Okay, this is the second clip I'm going to go over. Try to make it less than 20 and a half minutes. I've re-emphasized things many times in the first clip, but I don't need to do that quite as much in this one. So we see in the kill feed that this player has killed Voodoo. Helios has killed Voodoo, and we now have marked a Thursa, and so far we see 2 targets on our screen. We see a Thursa, and because this player had died at the exact same time that the kill feed pops up, just about, I think it's pretty safe to assume at this point, at least, that this is Helios. And we're continuing to shoot over the top of the cover. And the shots from Helios have come out a little bit high early into the animation of looking, which is a little bit weird, I would say. Very, very small, weird. And then there's a very fast adjustment. So they go from looking over their left hand to their right hand, which is part of the reason why the animation looks a little bit strange when they start aiming over the top of this cover. But then in basically one frame, they go from aiming to about the middle-ish of arc to the left side of arc, shooting about a couple shots or so, to, in one frame from here, snapping all the way over in this direction. And now they're shooting over here. And that degree of movement, just like in the first clip that I briefly brought up, also has that physics problem that I described. Even if your sense is very high, you can make extremely fast flicks or adjustments with a mouse. You can change your sensitivity so it's extremely high and play with like a mouse that's extremely light and maybe change your in-game sense so it's maxed out. You can have a really high sensitivity that you play in whatever game. And players are able to, if they really like, show an extremely high sensitivity if they want in a game. The problem comes when you're actually trying to control it in a meaningful way. And that's why we don't use like an infinite sensitivity adjustment, right? Because you still need to kind of control it. And with there's only so much control like a human can have. Some people can control sensitivities that are extremely high. That's fine. But regardless of the sensitivity that you use, your movements that go in one direction, they all have that physics problem. So if your sense is extremely high and you want to flick over to the side in a very small time frame, then what that also means is you have an extremely high sense that you need to be very precise, extremely precise, about stopping at an exact point without the aim, like over aiming, or when you stop it, jittering too much, because it's really hard to control that degree of movement. And that's kind of what we have here. It's possible that this player has made something like a 90-degree turn within about one frame, with a high enough sensitivity, but there are two things going on. One is being able to stop it effectively at that time, a very pinpoint spot, pretty much. It's just about pinpoint. I mean, it doesn't have to be the exact pixel, but it has to be roughly around that area. And with a sensitivity this high, for players who are really trying to get really strong flicks and are good at getting the really strong flicks and stopping, it affects a lot of things about their playstyle that you have to determine is good for you or not. But you still also need to just adjust for that stop. And so it turns out that pretty much everyone is relatively confident that there's only a certain window in which sensitivities make sense, even in a lot of super fast-paced shooters. And that window is generally going to be smaller, like the highest sensitivity that you'd use in some games, like let's say arena shooters. Gears would kind of fall under an arena shooter, but Quake, Unreal Tournament, Diabolical, games of this nature, maybe Fortnite, because of some of the building constraints that you need to turn different directions very quickly. These games, they still kind of require you to have a certain degree of control in a lot of situations. And so this kind of movement, if you're going to do a 90-degree turn within about one frame of this video in this game, it makes me think that the sensitivity is extremely high. Extremely high. Like, so high that you would notice it in the rest of their gameplay and very easily, and they would probably struggle with being pretty accurate a lot of the time. You could have a situation like this where the sensitivity is high and there's a one-off where they do a really good job at flicking and then sort of snapping and stopping at the target that they're looking at, and they don't really need to readjust that much, but that chance is very low. And so I would say, by looking at this, if this is the only information that I have about the player, I would assume that their sensitivity is probably just way too high than what they should be using in this game, because this game doesn't really call for a super high sensitivity. And it's probably just hindering their gameplay. But there's pretty much nothing else in the clip beyond there. So I'll end that here. Okay, this is the third clip that I'm going to be going over. This one is also pretty old. The canals clip is very old. The second clip was relatively old, and this one's also, I think, several years old. So we're right now we're crossing, and I'm going to assume that the player has all the information, or at least all the necessary information about where the enemies are likely to be, depending on what's been, the context of the clip. And we also, as a viewer, know that there's a teammate here that's shooting. And then also, we have some bullet trails here from what seems to kind of be the right side of the screen. And yeah, that can kind of be confirmed at this point. We also have, a player that we can sort of see on the right side. So I'm going to assume that in the context of this engagement, that this player that we're watching cross understands that there's a multi-directional cross going on from their teammates, and that they can generally bank on teammates to help cross. So with that in mind, I'll continue. So the direction change from one side of the wall to the other was relatively fast. And the first thing that I would kind of like to point out is that the aim of this player is doing a really good job. I mean, I would say this is actually about perfect of tracking from one side to the other as this character is kind of sliding across to the other side. I'll actually slow this down frame by frame. So the reticle was in a very reasonable location, and then it stays in kind of that reasonable location. And then this character starts moving off to the side. The reticle is now off. You notice that you need to now correct. So it's off for a little while and needs to correct. And now we're correcting. Now we're back on exactly. And we're continuing to hold full auto fire this whole entire time. And you can kind of tell because the shots are coming out obviously in regular intervals, and you're not going to see the bloom condense. We hold the body for here, so we've kind of transitioned over to this point, and this kind of looks relatively natural. But now we have something really weird going on. Now we have something very, very weird going on. So there are a few things to talk about here. So as this player goes down, if you want to maximize efficiency with your Lancer DPS, basically at the same time that you're crossing, you want to be engaged enough so that when a player starts going down into the down state, that you can now react to that happening. And why is this important? Well, this is really important because there are two mechanics going on. One is that when players are transitioning from their upright state to their completely down state, basically that entire animation, that entire process, they are invulnerable to a lot of types of damage from a certain range. If you're within kind of like an execution range distance, then it's possible you can get like some kind of instant kill mechanic weapon that you can use within a short range, and you can kill them while they're going into their down animation. So stuff like the boom shot, if you shoot it while they're going down, will insta-kill them. If you headshot them while they're going down, it'll insta-kill them. Torque bow, same thing. If it explodes on them while they're going into their down state, it'll insta-kill them because it just insta-kills. Same with a headshot, the torque bow. Same with a shotgun. There are a lot of things that can go through that kind of invincibility state, invulnerability state of the down animation. But weapons like the Lancer and Snub at a certain range will not do any damage. So the Lancer and the Snub, they both have bloom. And as you let go of your fire rate, the bloom condenses. So basically it means that your follow-up shots are going to be more accurate because they need to be within that bloom portion of the reticle. And so one thing that's really important to note, and what helps maximize DPS with any weapon that has bloom really, is that while you're not able to deal any meaningful damage, not only do you want to stop shooting to conserve ammo, but you also want to stop shooting to reduce your bloom so that when the target does get into a state where you can deal damage to them again, you already have your bloom condensed, and you can deal, on average, the highest DPS that you can. And so if you're consistently holding down your Lancer the entire time throughout that entire animation, it signals to me that you very much obviously have not learned to use the Lancer in its most effective way, at least in this aspect of the game. And that's one really important thing to note. In this situation, there's another thing that happens. So we recognize this player starts going down, and of course we humans, we have a reaction time, so there's only so much that you can kind of react to, but you need to be primed for it so that as soon as a player does go down, after a little bit, maybe a few shots or something, you're going to stop shooting, or at least you should stop shooting. And this is an objective thing. That can't be argued against. It's just objectively best to do this. There's no point in wasting ammo and keeping your bloom maxed out. So at this point in the down, we now have the reticle kind of aiming at this point around where the head is. And the reticle still hasn't moved. But now at this frame and past it, the reticle is now moving. And you can see with each frame that that reticle is moving in tandem, in perfect tandem with how this down is animating, basically, from in this position. Still in tandem. It's only having a slight degree of variation here, and by like a couple of pixels or something. And now we're moving, so now we've moved a little bit left, only slightly left, and now we're coming mostly just down to follow and track the down animation, which is fine. And now between these frames, we're kind of stuck on this kind of right armpit area for like 2 to 3 frames. And we've sort of stopped shooting our Lancer for just the briefest amount of time because the bloom had condensed a little bit and then just came back out. And now we can get damage on this player. And this is a reasonable place to continue firing at to try to finish the down. And it makes sense because there's a really good chance that you can finish this down before they get a revive. So we're kind of full autoing in the largest kind of area where the body is. And this player arguably could have gotten the revive, but it doesn't really matter. They do end up finishing the down. And so now this player is dead. And there's another player that's kind of in the reticle. And now we keep firing. Now we transition to kind of the body area. This is all fine. And the down started happening, but we're continuing to fire again. And not only we should have recognized that the down has started, but also the down is starting to go behind the cover. So there's even less of a reason to continue to shoot, even if you're maybe really slow to picking up on when the down is occurring, starting to happen. And we're going to fire several Lancer shots at absolutely nothing. It's going to take us a little bit long to recognize that there's no target here. Okay, this makes sense. Sure, trying to get our bearings back, so we spent a lot of time crossing here. That makes sense. Not entirely sure where all the enemies are at this point. We only saw 2 for this somewhat extended amount of time, so we're trying to get our bearings back by kind of looking around. And then the 2 players are dead, or dead and then, down, but I mean, you kind of know that they're dead now because Dumb's finished off Sospu. And now the other 2 players are marked, and we can see that in TACCOM. So we know exactly where all the enemies are right now. And we also know, especially as the viewer, that there's a really strong cross going on, and that these players are completely surrounded. from different angles, crossing angles. So they can stay here and only really take damage from chance in this direction, but that also puts them on a clock. So they're they're forced to make some kind of play, and probably the best play is to both turn around at the same time, get next to each other, and focus the shit out of chance, and try to kill him after they recognize that there's this player, and then they have to know that Domes is here, and then probably also know that Icy is here. All of these players are kind of, you should probably have a really good understanding that these three players are here, and that this player over here, Chance, is by himself. But that doesn't really matter so much right now. So now we're aiming in, letting us get our condensed bloom as we start to aim in, which is good because we want to be ready to start shooting with the most condensed bloom reticle that we can get. You want to do that, obviously, before they come into view. But this is really weird. This is actually very weird. It is really never, well, I wouldn't say never. It's not never a bad idea to kind of pre-fire like this. Like I'd say, and a lot of times it is kind of good. And I guess this makes a little bit of sense to start pre-firing, because you do kind of understand that these two players are kind of on a clock, and you're assuming that they need to make a decision, and if their decision is to come in this direction and kind of push the three, that you'll already start having shots on them. But at this range, and kind of this situation where they only have one player that's kind of pressuring them, it doesn't really make as much sense for me to think that pre-firing here is a great idea, especially when they've been behind cover for so long. But I'm going to kind of let this go a little bit because I don't think it's the worst decision at all to be pre-firing in this situation, but at least to optimize DPS in a more realistic sense, you kind of only want to start firing when you believe that they're very when they do come around the corner, or pre-fire only when you believe it's very pressing or very likely for them to come into your field of view. And then it's really important to put suppressing fire down. And it's a little bit difficult to delineate what those situations are. A lot of them could be like a sniper who is getting crossed out from one angle off to their side, and you're looking at them more straight on, and they're taking active damage from the side. And so, as soon as they come off the cover, you want to try to get damage on them a bit sooner. And a lot of times it can make sense to sort of wait, but it also can make sense that you put pressure over the top of their cover, and that if they want to peek over the cover to challenge you, that they are likely going to take a lot of extra damage, or at least one to two Lancer shots additionally, if they're going to do that. Like, usually you don't want to do that, but I'm just saying this is a situation where it could make a lot of sense to do so because it's very pressing for them to make a decision. Either they're going to aim with the sniper or they need to move. In this situation, it's not really clear that either is necessarily the case. Yes, there's a really good chance that they need to move, but it's not entirely clear that the direction that they're going to move is to the right. They could aggress on the teammate that's by themselves, or they could maybe necessarily just be waiting to get their health back before they make the push in that direction, or they're just crossing in that direction right now. It's sort of hard to say. But it ended up being the case that the player is sort of moving off to the right, and so we're pre-firing, and that makes a bit more sense. And now the player is going down. We haven't recognized that they're starting to go down as that starts to happen, so we've continued to shoot the entire time, except for that one point again, or we stopped firing for a very, very brief moment, and the bloom had condensed slightly and then just went back up again. And now we have this weird thing again, where the center of the reticle, in a very small time frame, with now a second player in this few second time frame. So this looks normal and kosher. Normal, normal. Transitioning to the middle of the body, sure, sure. Now we're like suit on the head. This is like upper torso area, kind of like around the neck. And the reticle has moved like about a subpixel in tandem with the down animation. And it has happened again. The reticle has moved and perfectly in tandem with this SK going down. Can't see this frame because of the flash. This is very pixelated. And now the reticle seems to have moved up potentially a little bit slightly in comparison to the down animation. Yep, but then it gets pulled down again or comes down. And now now the down animation had been completed and the reticle has moved down a couple of pixels. And a few more pixels again. The down has not changed, but there are a few more pixels where the aim is kind of directed itself over to the side. And now, obviously, the down can take damage, and you go ham, right? You just as much damage as you can, try to finish the down off before this player gets in a range. But if you're, well, yeah. So we keep shooting, and our reticle and a lot of and a bunch of this has been a bit larger than what we can see in the target. So you probably, instead of aiming like in this area above the head where a good chunk of the reticle is not on the model, you probably want to redirect your aim to sort of more the center of the model. And we keep focusing on the down. And the res didn't come off. Finish the down, transitioning to the other player. We're kind of aiming in that general location, then the aim's transition to the right, and now back over to the left, and then downward, and a diagonal. Now downward again, and now back down to the right. And the rest of that looked somewhat okay. But it's also interesting to note that while this Beast Rider or whatever was going to the down animation, this Mac model was occluding the model of that character. So there are a lot of like really jittery movements when you watch this at full speed. So particularly when Javon starts going down. So we've transitioned pretty quickly, but then as they're moving to the side, and as they're moving to the side and going into the down animation, our aim has gone right, left, right, right, left, right, and it's like it's jittering a lot again, which when you see it at full speed, it looks basically inhuman because of the degree of which the speed basically of the jitters. But if we say that it was done by a human, then I would again, just like the Canals clip, I would recommend that this player reduces their sensitivity or something, or tries to mitigate their jitters, because that's really bad. You don't want to have jitters like that happening very often, obviously. So yeah, that's about the end of that clip. Okay, this is the next clip. This is a slow-mo, a Lancer slow-mo. So far, this seems relatively okay. Obviously, now the reticle is over aiming to the right. So it seemed like the Baird was going to the left, so you're kind of tracking them left, and now they're cutting back over to the right. And so you kind of followed them. But now something strange already looks... there's already something strange like kind of happening. So I'm going to start here. So now the down occurs. The reticle is coming back over to the target. That's fine. And now it's here. But then in the next several frames, again, we have tracking on this particular part of the body that's in perfect tandem with this specific part of the body going in a diagonal downward motion because this character is going down. And this happens for many frames. And then there seems like a very small transition for like a few pixels or something over to the left some, and then we're doing it again. Then there's like a kind of tracking thing that happens that's like a second part. So here we're locked into this point, then there's a small transition to the left, and now we're on kind of this area that's kind of like the upper arm. And then we transition left again, and we're way off the head. But I understand we're like trying to figure out where the head's going to go, I guess. The problem is if you're looking to try to get headshots, it's like I've said several times already, with the Lancer, you want, in order to optimize DPS, you want to stop shooting when the character's going in its down animation. And then if you're going to try to pick a spot where the character is going to rest after its down animation completes and that you can deal damage to it again, you're going to wait until that period happens. You stop shooting, you react to the down, you let your bloom reset or condense some, and then you pick a point where you are going to predict the certain part of the body that you're going to try to focus on after the down completes. So a lot of times that could be a lot of the upper body area because it's a really large target. You're just trying to hit as many shots as possible. It depends on your range relative to the target. This range is relatively close, so I can understand actually looking for headshots when the down completes. But if you're going to do that, then it's much more sensible for players who are ready to predict where the model is going to end up after its invulnerability frames to stop shooting. Because if they recognize that's important, that mechanic is important, they're able to predict that or recognize that that's an important mechanic that you can play around, then it's also just a skip away from the player also understanding that it's important to stop shooting during invulnerability frames. I think that's not much to ask for as a very low bar. But they've continued to shoot the entire time, and they kind of predicted where the head would go and are still kind of full auto shooting in front of them. And then the head comes into this reticle location, and they continue to full auto fire here, which is fine because the model is kind of taken up pretty much the entire reticle, so you're going to be hitting almost every shot. And because the head is a little bit smaller than the max bloom, I think it's actually very reasonable to incorporate some of the body into the reticle here at the same time. Yeah, and a lot of that makes sense. And we stopped shooting about one shot after or so of the kill. So if I'm going to play this in real time, at least real time, you know, the slow-mo version of the clip. I'll do it one more time. Yeah, and if you notice, they're keeping full auto fire the entire time. full auto, a little bit condensed because they've kind of transitioned on their cover. And then, yeah, finish the kill out. Okay. Okay, in this clip, we have two separate instances. This is one. So this is as you're coming in for an up A here. I would say so the speed at which you shoot here is unreasonable, and it's actually a little bit hard to kind of explain why, because it's a little bit complicated. But the pre-aiming as you're coming in makes some sense. Screen angled here, and obviously if you're thinking about trying to aim for a hipfire, you need to compensate for that. So the target's going to be kind of in between the center of the screen where you're aiming and then where the shot is generally going to be coming out from around the muzzle of the barrel. There's a bunch of checks that are made in the game, but that's kind of, you know, how you're going to aim with a hipfire. And there are a few things to take note of every time, and a decision to up A and then shoot kind of happen at about the same time. There's several variables at play. One is for really, really good players, and I'm talking about probably the top, like, I guess 15 players, I guess, in the game, maybe, as far as I'm aware, will oftentimes, not all the time, because it's kind of hard to do that, but oftentimes on up A's, be aiming not only their hipfire, where the hipfire would be coming out, but also kind of hedge their pre-aim, where they're aiming as they're coming in to kind of do the up A, because you can't shoot while you're sliding in, right? So you're focusing on the target and then trying to move your camera to a position where it overlaps with either shot, either the hipfire shot or the LT shot that's way off to the side that kind of comes from center screen. But usually what you want to be doing is, while you're kind of trying to figure out which shot you're going to go for, you're also sort of hedging. So you're going to aim maybe mostly for the hipfire, but then you have the notion that you're preparing your brain so that if the player starts going wide from the cover, that you're also ready to do a pop shot soon. And all of this kind of takes place, you know, of course, during the sliding animation. But because you can shoot during any point of the up A animation, you can shoot at basically the first frame, and you can shoot at the very last frame of the up A animation. You can shoot at any point, either of those kinds of shots. You can hipfire or pop shot. It's important to think about the distance from the target and where you're aiming in relation to the target, so that either one of those two shots can connect. And then, as in terms of distance, it's also, if it's really important for you to be going for a gib kill, it's also important to recognize how close you might need to be to that character to get the amount of damage that you need, and or, you know, go for a one shot, hitting, you know, your 8 pellets that you need within gib range. So a lot of times in the up A, there are several things going on that are kind of complicated. But if a player is really close to you, then it does make a bit more sense to try to shoot early. The problem is, if you're dead set, basically at this point, you're pretty dead set on firing about as soon as possible, you generally want to be aiming your screen up a little bit more than this. Because as soon as the up A animation starts, as you notice, in this frame, because we're only like the third frame in maybe of kind of, or maybe the second frame of kind of just starting the up A, because I believe the up A has been buffered in this situation. So it's starting pretty much as soon as the character is kind of hits the cover and then is able to start the animation of going around the cover. But it shoots right here, and this is actually frame one of the up A, and the timing of this is very dubious or inconsistent because there is a high degree of error involved here, depending on what kind of cover you're sliding into. The shotgun muzzle generally starts kind of pointing inward and somewhat towards the ground, and in order to compensate for that, you need to be aiming like up in the air some, which this player is doing at this point. So parallel would be like aiming around here, which would also let you see more of the screen, so it kind of transition what the camera looks like. But the center of the screen is kind of around this area-ish, and then the shot has kind of come from here and then gone upward and this kind of diagonal area. But you can recognize that as soon as they hit the cover and the up A animation is about to start, they're definitely shooting frame one. And you don't see this behavior very much because there's so much room for error in a bunch of different ways. It depends on the angle of your camera, the size of the cover, the type of hitbox each cover has, and literally every corner of the game has its own kind of footprint for what the hitbox model is for each one. So some of the models will be designed so that they kind of have holes in them, and then there will be kind of like a separate pass that makes sure that the hitbox for the structure that's made in the game somewhat matches up with the model that was constructed. So on some, on a lot of maps where there's a quasi-symmetry going on, some maps will have like one low cover that's like perfectly solid all the way around, but then on the other side of the map with the same cover on the other side in a symmetrical sense might have some chips in it or something. And then a lot of times those chips will actually not have collision and not have shots, or not have or have shots that can go through basically those holes because they're the hitbox is replicated with the model very accurately. But in a lot of cases that isn't the case, and a lot of models do have kind of hitboxes that extend out further from the model that you see, and sometimes there are a lot of invisible walls. Ritual is probably the most damning example of that. Ritual has like about a dozen really large invisible walls that can block boom shots, shotgun shots, whatever. Some of them are even like around hip height, so it's really annoying. Sometimes they completely block shots. But anyway, so yeah, I think so. This corner has a very accurate hitbox associated with it, and I sort of know that from putting a ridiculous amount of time into the game and kind of experimenting with it. So I know you can sort of shoot a little bit more early as long as you're not aiming too far inside, so that the shot that's really early kind of touches the wall enough so that in a lot of instances the shot will get stuffed into the wall. But it's really hard for me to assume that a lot of other players kind of have that kind of degree of understanding. But I can just say, for the sake of argument or whatever, they understand that. And so maybe when they up A on the right hand on this cover in particular, they're much more confident about shooting sooner. And fine, that's fine. So they're shooting earlier on a cover that's a little bit safer to do so than most. They're also aiming up a little bit because I guess you can't react to someone fast enough within that window. So you pretty much have to predict and assume that you're going to be going with the hip fire and you're going to be aiming assuming that that's the only shot you're going to be going for. And so you aim up to compensate for that because you're going to be shooting really early and you're definitely going to be doing a hip fire shot. So those things sort of match up a little bit, but it's like the relative confidence of it is a bit strange in this situation. But okay. Yeah, we can keep going. So now we've slid into this cover. We see these two players. We're now during the up A, now focusing very intently on these two players and have started shooting as soon as possible, which is, I guess, okay. We're shooting, and now basically this entire time after the up A animation is completed, the first thing that I take note of is that this player has not stopped moving. And so with another portion of crossing / specifically Lancer efficiency that I'd like to bring up because it's relevant at this point, is that while you're moving, obviously your bloom is larger than it could be otherwise if you were standing still. And in this position, you're not opening up more of the angle to the left. There's no good reason to be doing that because as you're walking to the right, you're opening up this angle, seeing more of to the left of these two characters. And honestly, if anything, as you're coming in, it makes a little bit more sense to actually hold around where the cover was. Maybe come off the cover and go into the corner or something and be standing there because these two players, they're both looking towards the teammate and kind of focusing on that direction. And there's no real indication that you have as you're coming upon this situation that they're both going to be moving off to the left. And so there's not a whole lot of reason for you to be exposing more of like the left side of this. So while you're moving to the right, you're keeping your bloom larger, which means that you're, especially at this range, losing DPS. You're effectively losing DPS, and it's objectively not good to be doing this. The only time that you want to be moving is if you have a really good reason to do so. Either it doesn't really matter because your bloom at its max bloom state is still covering the target that you're shooting at, and so it doesn't really matter. It still can matter because if they're moving left and right, then the larger your bloom is, the more chances there are of one of the shots going off to the side. So you're just increasing your odds of missing. But yeah, in this situation, having cover gives you a bit of an advantage for bloom and spread, and also you're standing still. So that's another compounded addition, I guess, in efficiency for DPS output that isn't taken advantage of here. And they're kind of moving off to the side. Another thing to note is they could be moving forward, especially at this point. I can say for certainty that there's a little bit of space here, and actually this straight line from here to where the players are, this is completely free. The cover, the corner of the cover is right here. It's only blocking kind of like, it's actually not blocking any movement in here. I don't think they're up against the wall. But definitely at this point, they could be moving forward, which if they're going to keep their bloom spread all the way, they could be moving forward to just be closer to get, better damage output. So if you see they're up A here, they're moving right, turning left a little bit, but still moving right. And this wall keeps moving away from them. So if they still want to be on the stairs, they still could be, and they could be a little bit closer to the two targets they're shooting at. But for whatever reason, this player's decided to continue moving out to the right. Now I'm going to just continue. So yeah, they had enough space here. This direct line for probably about a third of a second or so as they were moving to the right, maybe half a second, was relatively free. They could have been moving forward if they wanted to. So they stopped here after they stopped firing, and there's enough distance here for the character to actually start sliding, doing like an actual slide animation. Because if they're up against the wall, um, obviously they wouldn't be sliding, right? They'll just go into cover, right? They'll just the model will condense and they'll just get into cover. But there's enough space here. So they slid into the corner and they did an up A. And they're turning around. I don't know what this is about. I don't really care. Yeah, and then the clip ends. So now I'm going to look at the aim. So now I've kind of covered a lot of the decision making outside of the aim, basically all of it, or a lot of it, not all of it. I'm going to be looking at aim. So right now it's in a really good spot where they started aiming. It's kind of roughly in the center of both of the players. And they're right next to each other. It's kind of hard to see. It's very pixelated. So right now it seems like the reticle is focused on this player. And they were going down because they kind of like traded. They traded downs. So this player, according to the kill feed, is down this player. And then the player that was downed here also downed this other player that was next to them. So they kind of traded, and they were both going into their down state. So as long as that's happening, it doesn't make sense to transition because they're now in their invulnerability period. And it's only at this point when the down animation is completed, they keep shooting at the Hoffman, and now they switch back pretty quickly to the down, and now they switch back to Hoffman, and now they stop shooting completely. So that's also a little bit problematic. So shooting in the general area is fine. Then they recognize that the player is going down, and so they switch targets. That's very good. Now they're shooting at fake 05, fine. But you don't want to ever do this. And I think it's very obvious for anyone who's really played almost any games, but particularly Gears 5, that, again, you kind of want to focus target. The stopping damage on this player when you have a lot of damage on them doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you're very close to getting a down. And then swapping to the player that's getting picked up is weird because, one, you're splitting damage, but then two, it means that you're giving both of these players a really strong chance of not getting down to anymore at all because of this context. So if you stop shooting at fake completely, then they're not going to take additional damage from you, and you can just assume that they're not going to go down. Shooting at the down here from this range and this distance with this amount of bloom, even if you were like perfectly, I mean, I could tell you right now, even if you started with perfect bloom, very condensed bloom, and then you started with like even a headshot or something, and went into almost full auto or whatever, and you're actually optimizing DPS from here, you have nowhere near the amount of time needed to down this player before they get back up and then move behind some kind of cover or like roll, there's just not enough time. And so not only is it important to finish the damage that you have on one player to down them, but also there's not as much reason for you to be shooting at this player because ostensibly no one else is going to be shooting at them, and so you're not going to have the ability to actually down them on your own. So there are like a plethora of problems going on here, and you really don't see very many players, especially theoretically very good players, swap their damage like this and their target priority from one to the other in this kind of context because it doesn't make sense to do. A lot of people, if they, make mistakes, they're going to be mistakes that are a little bit more obvious. Like everyone and their mom kind of knows to focus one character to try to down them. And a lot of the mistakes they might make are kind of about positioning or moving, which is maybe what I'd consider this perpendicular movement off to the right to be, just an unawareness of mechanics or a disregard for caring about being efficient or whatever the case might be. It's very benign. But very few people will actually purposefully stop shooting at one character, especially one that's taken a lot of damage like this, and swap to another one, unless you have like a really good reason to do so. And if you have a really good reason to do so, I would say that's a very high level of awareness to split damage so that if you do have teammates, that there's a greater chance that they can both go down at roughly the same amount of time, or not same amount of time, but roughly the same time, so they have a smaller window to try to revive each other. And that's a very, very high level idea that I would say not 15, but maybe about 50 people, maybe like the top 50 players in the game, are relatively aware of and actually implement somewhat regularly in their gameplay. And so far, with a lot of the decisions that I've seen this player make so far, I'm not, for the most part, I'm not expecting them to maybe necessarily understand splitting damage and how important that could be. But regardless, it doesn't matter in this situation because just from what we can see in the video, there's no reason to believe that either of these players, but specifically this player on the right that's going to get revived, is going to get downed again. So yeah, they got picked up, and then after they got picked up, you sort of went back to, I guess, the Hoffman or fake again. So really weird. I'm going to play full speed. So yeah, there was that one transition that looked really weird, or actually weird, and not just like maybe just bad decision making. So it's basically, yeah, this one where the reticle goes from the Hoffman or the player on the left to the down, and then back to the Hoffman in just a matter of a few frames. So Hoffman, down, back to the Hoffman. Just very, 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 very weird and not optimal. And there are a lot of inefficiencies here that kind of pile up on top of each other and don't make a whole lot of sense. So this clip is going to be really short, and I'm going to play it at full speed on my end, even though the clip is slowed down dramatically. And then I'll go frame by frame, and then I'll just play at full speed again. So that was the full speed, and then I'll just go do frame by frame. And we're going back down. So obviously that jerky movement is, again, something that's inhuman. No player can actually do that, even if they wanted to replicate it, because the speed at that, the speed of the movement and the speed of how quickly, I guess, it stops is basically impossible to do. It's impossible to do for humans. So here, and really less than a frame in this video, but let's say about a frame, it snaps over into this direction. And then the other thing on top of this with the extremely strange camera movement is also, if we continue down with a few more frames, within a very reasonable window, the player that might have been snapped to is coming around the corner here out of spawn. And so if we go back, you can see this. So it snaps to here. I'll actually go to exactly where it snaps to. So the center of the camera is probably about here, I'd say. which is like maybe head height behind that wall or something like that. And then a few more frames and they start coming out. So I would say on its own, just that camera movement alone, there doesn't actually have to be anyone like over there, but that definitely adds layers of problems to this clip. But just the camera movement on its own is inhuman, actually not possible to do, at least from a human movement. It also doesn't make a whole lot of sense because if for whatever reason, let's say you do have information about what's going on over here, for whatever reason, maybe there's a really strange sound that happens in this direction. And you have like giga Dolby Atmos on like 1,000 decibel volume on your, $50,000 headphones or whatever's. Even if you had a sound that's kind of played over there, if you're going to play with that information that's known, you don't look into the wall. You look at to where the player would be coming out from, right? Because that's how you can kind of affect the fight. You can't shoot through the wall, so there's not a whole lot of reason to shoot through the wall. But if you're that certain that you're willing to, like, I don't know, do a flick or something about whether someone's over in that direction, if you really think that is the case, you pre-aim here. That's just the normal, natural thing to do. But there was a flick, and there's a recorrection back down, and then they're moving back over. So flick, and then a weird like recorrection that comes back really quickly, and then they're moving back over. And their camera centering is actually pretty far off from the corner of that cover. The center camera is like over here. And obviously, if they knew someone was coming over here, you'd want to be pre-aiming here. Okay, this is the next video. So I guess I'm going to play this at full speed first, and then I'll go back through it frame by frame. So here's full speed. And here's frame by frame. So at this point, during the forward roll animation, the reticle jumps pretty horizontally to the right over to kind of where the head is right now, and is sort of following the head, but it's a little bit lagged behind. And then back to a kind of median center point of the model as it's going through the roll animation. And then it kind of comes back up, but not really aiming in the center of the model, over to the side. And then we're kind of continuing to do that by aiming more to the right. And basically, there are several things that I could talk about. I'll try to keep this a bit brief. There is a trigonometry mechanic, which is kind of a meme, but there's a trigonometry mechanic in the game that happens in pretty much every third-person game, where there's a discrepancy between what the camera sees in the camera's perspective in a third-person game, and generally what happens with the shots. And for a lot of games, they kind of have to figure out and determine how this discrepancy is managed. And in Gears, there are several mechanics in place to try to help smooth that over and kind of manage that kind of discrepancy. Gears has several ways of doing this. One is that there's a greater degree of, I'm going to just call it aim assist, that's intrinsic in the game, that's beyond the traditional versions of aim assist, where the center point of the third-person aiming perspective is kind of a little bit more to the left side of the reticle, because the reticle is in the center of the screen. And there's an adjustment mechanic where the bullet as it's traveling from the left side of the screen to where you're aiming specifically is coming in from the left side. So there's a bit of a left side bias, at least in this case. You could, in Gears 5 and like Gears 2 or whatever, you can lefty flip, so you're hard aiming with the reticle in the center of your screen and the model on the right side. And then you'd have a right side bias where the shot is the game wants you to think the shot's kind of coming from the gun, but it's mostly not. When you're LTing, the shot's kind of coming from center screen. But there are also, while you're LTing, there are checks in place determining based on what weapon that you're using. So at least for the shotgun, I can say that there's, even when you're LTing on right hand, there's a check that's made on your elbow, your right elbow, which is the arm that the shotgun is kind of in primarily. That's the hand that pulls the trigger. So the shotgun, the shot check, I guess, the check from where the shot can come out, it pretty much starts from where the elbow is. So in a lot of instances, and you can easily replicate this, you can shove your right elbow into a wall or something, and in a lot of cases, it's not the easiest to replicate, but in a lot of cases, you can definitely get your elbow to stuff the shot into the wall that your elbow is in. And there are additional checks that are made across the arm and up to the muzzle of the barrel. And for the snub, as far as I'm aware, there's no like arm or elbow check, but there might actually be a hand check, and there's definitely a muzzle check for the snub. And then up to the LT shot, because of how it tries to kind of determine where the shot's coming from and where it's going to in the reticle, there's a bit of a bias in between those 2 points. So I've noticed, like with the M bar in particular, you do actually really want to, because the M bar I think is counted as a bit of a projectile in a sense. So it has that rule that's a little bit more precise about how the M bar shot comes out from the gun and then goes to the reticle. Whereas with the long shot, it is a hit scan weapon that does very much come from the center of the screen. So as long as your reticle is on the head at all and you shoot, it doesn't seem to matter where the bias is, because all the game is doing is trying to make a check at exactly the center point of where the reticle is to make sure that the shot is going to connect properly. Whereas with the M bar, because I believe it's probably a projectile at extremely high speed, and if it's not a projectile, then I think the game is kind of programming it in a way that's kind of projectile based, even though it might be hit scan. There's a little bit more of a left reticle bias going on with the M bar. So that's a little bit of additional stuff about the game. But in this situation, and in a lot of situations of the game, you do want to try to aim biased to the outside of the target that you're aiming to, because of that left side, I guess, bias for where the shot is going to connect. And a lot of times, the reason why it's problematic to do that, especially in short range, is because there's not much of a reason to try to be that precise. Because if you're trying to aim, well, it's not necessarily precision, but if you're trying to aim on the right side of a model that's really close to you, the reason why that's bad and why you don't see any like normal person do that is because all they need to do is just put an ever so slight amount of movement direction in the opposite direction from the reticle, and then the reticle can immediately recognize that it's not on a player anymore, so you don't really get that bias, that like shot correction bias anymore, because you're not actually aiming on the model at that point. So even though there's a very, very slight like left bias or whatever, there's still sort of a check in the center of the reticle as to whether the shot should and will hit and connect or not. And so even in situations like this, you still want to be generally aiming in like the center of whatever the largest target is to get damage. Or if you're like, I don't know, a super god or something, you can kind of track a forward roll with kind of muscle memory or whatever, and kind of knowing the total path of the forward roll. And so you can try to get a lot of headshots during that animation. But yeah, like almost the entire portion of this, this player is aiming with an extreme right side bias that is not sensible because, like I said, all this player needs to do is move just ever so slightly off to the side in the other direction, and all of a sudden they're not in the reticle anymore, and then you lose damage. And that's not something that you can react to. It's something that you would have to predict, and of course, predicting is a bit RNG, a little bit RNG. There are a lot of predictions you need to make in gaming to make yourself a better player or more accurate overall on the long run, but it's still kind of an RNG thing. Whereas reacting is not an RNG thing. You see something, and then after it happens, then you can kind of react to it. So this is something that the roll can kind of be predicted because it's stuck in an animation the entire time, but then as soon as they come out of the roll, you kind of have to predict a lot more. So right side bias. Now we're on the left side, but then we zip over to the right really quickly, and actually, as the player is going down, we made an extremely fast correction from the left to the right, and then from this point down to here was very slow and very smooth. And then same thing with the rest of this. Extreme right bias, and in fact, I think they've probably missed a shot because of that bias. No, I guess it probably still hit. They missed one, though, towards the end of the roll. Yeah, very strange. But basically, as the legs, as they're kind of coming back up, they probably shot to the right of the head. And yeah, for probably about 80% of this entire little engagement and mag dump, they're aiming way off to the right of the player, which is very strange. You really don't see anyone else do that. And like I said, there are some really good reasons as to why. Because even though you'll see like the bots in the game aim way off to the right, they have a kind of different aiming mechanism that's going on. And I'm not sure if that's maybe what's happening here. But you don't really see any human players, especially any of them that claim that they're doing that good of a job at tracking a roadie run, a forward roll, and then a direction change after the forward roll with this tracking. You don't see any of them that are potentially like that good, that consistently, also consistently aim way off to the right. So yeah, that's very weird. Okay, so this is the last clip that I'm going to cover for now. Actually, yeah, I'll play this at full speed. Okay, so now I'm going to slow it down. So this so far looks, relatively kosher. And then we're coming over here, and then we're doing an up A. We're also LTing at the same time. And then during up A's, you don't even need an LT, but during up A's, because your player's positioning changes not only forward and backward, but also left to right, because as you're upping around the corner, you're going wider right. It sort of changes where your camera placement is. And that's just, a fact of the game. It's pretty natural. So as you're coming out around the cover on the right side, naturally your aim is kind of adjust to the right. But it's only about this frame when there seems to be potentially a little bit of, I guess, input. Yeah, so right about here. Here, and then that is the first input. That is definitely the first input. And the direction is generally towards the head. But this is the first frame that we've noticed that there's an actual input that was made that's beyond what the up A animation is doing by affecting the screen. And it's moving over to the right. And what's kind of interesting about this is that it's obvious when you slow it down that the shot comes out at the very latest, the shot comes out at the same time this reticle goes over the head of the Kate. But that's the very, very latest. And we can almost kind of say that it came out possibly even a little bit before then. Yeah, so you can see that there's a bit of it's kind of strange. The reticle was here and the Kate was kind of moving that direction. So I'm just going to say that was pretty much about the earliest that you could possibly shoot for the Kate moving into the direction to the left, and the reticle goes over and across that point and fires as they're transitioning to about here. And this is the first frame where the reticle has not moved. This is about the second frame where basically the reticle has not moved. That's the third frame, fourth, fifth, sixth, maybe seventh. Eighth, it looks like there's some degree of movement. Ninth, 10th, 11th, and now there's like a diagonal movement, which seems a bit more indicative of human input. Coming back down like this direction. I would say this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do, but maybe if you're going to shoot here and then you're going to try to like move back over to try to shoot the Kate if they're over to the left, because you're going to expect them to be more to the left if they don't die in this shot, then whatever, sure. The biggest problem with this is the speed at which the transition happens, the original transition from here to here, to the right side of the head. And then also the speed at which the shot comes off as they're going across. Now, if they're doing a flick shot where they flick over to the side and shoot while they're flicking, that can be reasonable. However, there is a problem with that because while the player is flicking at that speed, like several other clips before that I've mentioned, it's basically impossible to stop your reticle on a dime like that. It's just not really something that anyone can do with any real consistency. But at least at this point, it seems like there is a degree of consistency to that. There's a kind of snap that goes on to a certain point, and then it sort of stops at that one particular moment. So this movement is very, very fast, and then it stops just to the right side of the head. And the movement is extremely fast. The reticle stops, and then there's like no input on the reticle after this point. So not only does it have to stop moving completely, but also if a human was trying to flick, 9 times out of 10 or whatever, a large degree of large percentage of the time, they would flick. They would try to shoot at about the same time. Maybe they get a bit fortunate and get the timing right, and they would transition across the head and flick and shoot at the right time, and then the reticle would end up over to the side of them. But then they would be making adjustments after that because they know they're making that flick. So they're going to be assuming that their reticle is going to end up over onto the right side of the character. And they already know, because they've already made the flick input, that not only do they want to stop the reticle, but they want to move it back to the left again. Because if this character doesn't die, they need to get back on target as soon as possible. And so they should just assume that that's going to happen, right? But in this instance, it's like a flick that goes perfectly to the right side of the head. It stops in an exact dead point and then stays there for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, some downward input, 8, some more downward like input or something, 9, maybe some more, 10, maybe a little bit more. And it's only like 11 where there's like a diagonal input that's made in. And that's on top of this is all on top of the intrinsic vertical recoil that the Boltok has in the game. So if you were to try to replicate this, for example, as soon as you fired the shot, there would be what I would say a moderate degree of vertical recoil. And if you don't make an adjustment downward and you just shoot at this point and you don't make any downward inputs at all to try to manage the recoil, this reticle would end up like over here. But not only did the shot come out at the perfect time and stop dead center, but also part of the reason why it looks super weird is because it perfectly negates the vertical recoil. And I don't mean like reasonably perfectly, like, wow, you did a good job. I mean like actually perfectly negated it. Whereas if you showed this clip to someone who doesn't play the game, they'd be like, oh, okay, the shot came out and I guess the gun doesn't have any vertical recoil. Right? So it stops in the dead center, perfectly negates the vertical recoil. And not only does it stop on a dime there, but it comes downward, which is not really what you would expect. But what's kind of interesting is even if you spent a large degree or a large amount of time in the game mitigating that vertical recoil with the Boltok at about the same time, you are going to get relatively good at it, but it is not something that you can consistently do. And it's probably maybe like a 1 in a million for you to be able to mitigate that vertical recoil. I mean, maybe it's a slight exaggeration, maybe like 1 in 500,000 or 1 in 100,000, that you can perfectly manage the recoil so that your reticle, at least in relation to this clip, stops dead center. Very quick flick, stops, horizontal movement perfectly, shot, no vertical recoil, stopped perfectly, comes down very, very slightly after 7 frames for about 3 frames, and then goes diagonally down to the bottom left. There are probably like 3 really strong problems with that, like really strong problems. And so I would say with the totality of evidence here that there's an almost certainty that in at least a lot of the instances that are shown in these clips, that there is some amount of cheating going on. And I'm not sure specifically what exactly. I can only analyze and kind of show this is what a reasonable person would do. And these are kind of the decisions that an extremely good player would make, that a lot of these don't happen with this player. But also I can say that there are a lot of really weird things that happen with this player very consistently that you will not see. It's not even don't see. It's that if you go looking for them, you will not find them with any person who's playing the game naturally. So you actually have to go looking for people who are playing the game unnaturally to find anything that's similar to this. Um, yeah, and I think that's very sad. Um, but part of the reason why I wanted to bring up a lot of the decision making in this compilation of clips is that there is also the additional aspect where there are a bunch of players who cheat in the game, and there's some things that are really weird about them because their behavior is very strange, just because it's different, or how effective they are in the game doesn't match up with their decision making, and that's another really big red flag. Because if you're extremely good in some facets of the game, then you're likely very good at learning other facets of the game as well and understanding what it is that is important, and how to play the game effectively. And if you're showing a very strong degree of accuracy, even if the accuracy is strange, if your decision making looks extremely poor, then it's kind of like one of two things. Either you're a very high level aimer and you're very new to the Gears game, or you're potentially not as new to the Gears game, likely, and you're cheating in some way. You're doing stuff that's very strange, and those two things don't match up very well. You can't have well, and it's like, and it's not even necessarily that this player has a high degree of accuracy, which is sort of also part of the issue. Um, because in order to have a high degree of accuracy, you also need to have good decision making. So, like I laid out with the Lancer clips, it's important to stop moving, know distances, predict where the player is going to go while they're going down the down animation, knowing that they're going to be invulnerable during that animation, and then making decisions and adjustments regarding the mechanics of the game after spending thousands of hours in the game. If you're unable to learn those parts of the game after spending, countless hours in the game, and you're really good in some areas and just really bad in other areas, there's a very large discrepancy there, and that's another massive red flag. So I think that's going to end this segment of clips for now. But yeah, I mean, people can give me their thoughts, I guess, on any of this stuff, but I don't think it really matters that much to me anymore. I think it might just be interesting to hear perspectives from other people. I don't think it's going to change mine too much at this point because I've been seeing this for years now. But yeah, thank you for watching.